Mainstream media outlets across Washington and New York are broadcasting a very specific narrative about President Donald Trump and his recent trade skirmishes. They are telling the public that the administration secured a flawless victory on March 11th, 2025, forcing Canada to back down within 24 hours after Ontario Premier Doug Ford attempted to challenge American economic dominance. This official version of events presents a classic tale of American leverage working exactly as intended, supposedly protecting American consumers from an aggressive 25% surcharge on electricity. This corporate narrative completely misses the entire point of what actually transpired during that critical window. The 24-hour standoff between Toronto and Washington was not a Canadian surrender. It was a successful live-fire demonstration of a devastating geopolitical weapon that no Canadian province had ever dared to deploy in the modern history of the two nations. Ontario Premier Doug Ford did not lose. He effectively showed the White House that Canada holds a critical chokehold over the daily operations of major industrial centers in Michigan, New York, and Minnesota. The continuous flow of power across the northern border is no longer just a routine commercial arrangement. By briefly implementing that 25% surcharge on electricity flowing to 1,500,000 American homes and businesses, Ontario proved it has both the legal authority and the political willingness to disrupt the American economy. President Donald Trump responded with fierce rhetoric, threatening a 50% tariff escalation and a national emergency. But the reality is that Washington shifted its position because American stock markets began to slide instantly. The global trade landscape is radically shifting as the July 1st, 2026 review deadline for the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement approaches. The unresolved disputes over automotive parts, dairy markets, and steel tariffs are pushing both nations back to the edge of a dangerous cliff. The underlying vulnerability of the interconnected North American power grid remains completely exposed to future political maneuvers. This investigation decodes how Ontario quietly flipped the power dynamic of the entire continent, why the Trump administration is deeply concerned about this invisible leverage, and how this shadow conflict is already dictating the true cost of the energy powering your home. The era of predictable, quiet cooperation is officially over, and the energy border is now a fully functional weapon. The timeline of this economic confrontation unfolded with blinding speed, moving faster than almost any bilateral trade dispute in recent memory. The initial fuse was lit on Monday, March 10, 2025, when Ontario Premier Doug Ford stepped up to a press conference podium and blindsided Washington. Effective immediately, Ontario imposed a 25% surcharge on all electricity exported directly to New York, Michigan, and Minnesota. This was a direct, calculated retaliatory strike against the sweeping tariffs President Donald Trump had placed on Canadian steel and aluminum. Government models projected this single energy surcharge would extract up to $400,000 every single day from the American economy, depending entirely on seasonal demand. It instantly altered the economic landscape for the 1,500,000 American homes and businesses that rely on Canadian electrons to keep their lights on. The reaction from Washington was swift and furious. At dawn on Tuesday, March 11, 2025, President Donald Trump launched an immediate counter-offensive before the Canadian surcharge had even completed a full 24 hours in effect. Utilizing his Truth Social platform, President Donald Trump announced that the United States would retaliate by doubling its planned tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum imports, skyrocketing the rate from 25% to a staggering 50%. President Donald Trump warned the public that Ontario would pay a financial price so massive that historians would write about it for decades to come. Behind the scenes in Washington, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt and spokesman Kush Desai prepared to declare a national emergency on electricity across the entire American Northeast and Midwest, signaling that the administration was ready to treat the energy grid as an active combat zone. By mid-morning on Tuesday, the shockwaves hit Wall Street. United States stock markets began to slide significantly as investors realized that a routine cross-border commercial arrangement had turned into a critical infrastructure crisis. Grid operators at the New York Independent System Operator and ISO New England were suddenly forced to recalculate their cost structures for peak demand hours, factoring in an unprecedented geopolitical premium on the electricity flowing through interconnected transmission lines. The peak of the crisis lasted only a few hours before the financial pressure forced both sides to look for an exit ramp. By Tuesday afternoon, the high-stakes chess match shifted to direct personal diplomacy. Ontario Premier Doug Ford picked up the phone and initiated a direct conversation with United States Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. The conversation was described as intensely productive, shifting the narrative away from public threats toward an organized framework for negotiations. Howard Lutnick agreed to schedule an immediate meeting in Washington with Doug Ford and the United States Trade Representative just 2 days later, on Thursday, March 13th, to address the broader economic relationship under the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement before the critical April 2nd reciprocal tariff deadline. Simultaneously, Doug Ford reached out to Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, a leader whose state was directly caught in the crossfire. In a personal phone call, Doug Ford apologized for the disruption, emphasizing their 7-year working relationship and mutual friendship. This parallel diplomatic channel diffused the immediate political pressure. By late Tuesday afternoon, the confrontation reversed entirely. Ontario agreed to suspend the 25% energy surcharge, and President Donald Trump simultaneously withdrew the threat of the 50% tariff escalation. When the dust settled, Global News reported that the one-day energy surcharge had successfully generated $260,000 during its brief operational window. While the White House publicly framed this rapid de-escalation as a massive American negotiating victory driven by the sheer leverage of the United States economy, the underlying reality was far more complex. The surcharge was merely suspended, never permanently rescinded. The mechanism remains fully intact, a loaded economic weapon sitting quietly on the northern border. The superficial media reports focus heavily on the political theater of the 24-hour standoff, but the true geopolitical reality lies deep beneath the surface of this trade dispute. For over half a century, policymakers in Washington treated the Dominion of Canada as an economic afterthought, viewing the northern neighbor merely as a passive supplier of lumber, dairy products, and agricultural goods. This dismissive perspective caused successive American administrations to overlook the massive structural vulnerability that binds the United States to Canadian critical infrastructure. The interconnected North American power grid is not a simple commercial marketplace where electricity is bought and sold freely without consequence. It is a highly complex, interdependent physical network where national borders blur entirely, and Ontario holds a disproportionate amount of strategic leverage. The fundamental architecture of American energy transmission means that major regions of the United States are physically incapable of maintaining grid stability during peak periods without Canadian cooperation. Entities like the New York Independent System Operator and ISO New England routinely rely on massive inflows of cheap, reliable hydroelectric power and nuclear generation from Ontario to prevent catastrophic blackouts during periods of extreme weather and peak consumer demand. This structural export surplus has flowed quietly across the border for decades, operating as a routine commercial arrangement that remained completely invisible to the general public on both sides of the border. By transforming this invisible infrastructure into an active bargaining chip, Ontario effectively shattered the illusion of American energy independence. The economic confrontation of March 2025 proved that the continuous flow of electricity is not guaranteed, changing the entire cost calculus for utility companies and grid operators across the American Northeast and Midwest. This maneuver exposes the core concept of the weaponization of interdependence. In modern geopolitics, traditional military force is often secondary to the control of vital supply chains and energy corridors. Canada cannot compete with the sheer economic size of the United States or the executive powers of President Donald Trump in a traditional tariff war. However, the leadership in Ontario recognized that an asymmetrical strike on a critical vulnerability could produce immediate localized pain in key electoral and industrial states. The dependency of Michigan, New York, and Minnesota on Canadian energy means that any surcharge or reduction in supply acts as an immediate tax on American manufacturing, heavy industry, and residential consumers. It introduces a volatile geopolitical risk factor directly into regional electricity pricing models that grid operators had never previously needed to consider. This strategic reality goes even deeper than the electricity grid, extending into the most vital lifelines of American heavy industry. Deep within the analytical frameworks of Canadian trade strategists lies what commentators openly refer to as the nuclear option of economic warfare. This option involves the potential restriction or total cessation of Canadian crude oil exports to the United States. While no provincial or federal government has seriously attempted to implement such a severe measure due to the catastrophic economic damage it would cause to both nations, the mere existence of this theoretical possibility fundamentally alters how Washington must approach trade negotiations. The United States Midwest and Northeast are deeply dependent on Canadian energy baseloads to fuel their automotive factories, heat their homes, and power their financial centers. When Ontario demonstrated the legal mechanism and the political willingness to weaponize the electricity grid with less than 24 hours of notice, it sent a clear, unambiguous signal to the Trump administration that Canada possesses the capability to disrupt the American domestic economy from within. The iceberg of energy interdependence means that every trade threat issued by Washington now carries a direct risk to the physical infrastructure that keeps the United States functioning. The illusion of security is gone. The confrontation between President Donald Trump and Ontario Premier Doug Ford perfectly illustrates the classic political foil of traditional economic brute force colliding with precise, asymmetrical infrastructure leverage. President Donald Trump operates on a philosophy of visible, overwhelming pressure, utilizing massive public threats, sweeping tariff announcements, and aggressive media positioning to dictate terms to foreign trading partners. His immediate instinct to escalate the steel and aluminum tariffs from 25% to 50% was designed to project absolute authority and force an immediate Canadian capitulation. He expected the traditional playbook to work seamlessly, assuming that a smaller economic partner would fold under the sheer weight of the American executive power. But President Donald Trump miscalculated the immediate domestic feedback loop of his own rhetoric. The aggressive threats did not intimidate Toronto. Instead, they sent an immediate shockwave through the financial foundations of the United States. The receipts of this failure are clearly visible in the rapid reaction of the financial markets on Tuesday, March 11, 2025. United States stock markets did not rally behind the White House positioning. They slid into negative territory as Wall Street realized the catastrophic implications of a protracted energy war. The boomerang effect was instantaneous. By threatening to double tariffs and declaring an impending national emergency on electricity, the administration inadvertently highlighted the profound vulnerability of the American energy supply, causing immediate anxiety among industrial manufacturing corporations and utility providers throughout the American Northeast and Midwest. The technical data from that single day reveals how rapidly the leverage shifted. The 25% surcharge did not need to shut down the transmission lines to inflict severe strategic damage. It immediately altered the automated pricing models utilized by grid operators at the New York Independent System Operator and ISO New England. These entities operate on razor-thin margins of supply and demand, and the sudden introduction of a 25% geopolitical premium on Canadian hydroelectricity forced them to instantly recalculate their cost structures for peak demand hours. The financial reality forced senior American officials to abandon their public posture of total defiance within hours. Instead of forcing Canada to its knees, the White House was compelled to open a direct, urgent line of communication. United States Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick was forced to bypass standard bureaucratic protocols to engage in a direct, productive dialogue with Premier Doug Ford that very afternoon. The ultimate proof of the Canadian strategic victory lies in the joint statement issued by both leaders, which secured an immediate seat for Ontario at the negotiating table in Washington to discuss the renewal of the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement well ahead of the crucial April deadlines. President Donald Trump was forced to entirely rescind his 50% tariff escalation on the exact same day. The administration loudly claimed a public victory through press briefings, but the hard data proves that Washington blinked first because the alternative was an immediate energy cost crisis for 1,500,000 American voters. The illusion of absolute American leverage was shattered by the cold reality of an interconnected power grid. The true danger of this geopolitical chess match does not reside in the high-level boardroom meetings in Washington or the corporate offices in Toronto. The immediate consequences of this energy war land directly on your kitchen table, impacting your monthly household budget and your personal financial security. Mainstream commentators frequently discuss trade wars as abstract concepts involving distant corporations and elite politicians. You need to understand that the 25% electricity surcharge weaponized by Ontario is a direct, immediate tax on your daily life. When a state like Michigan, New York, or Minnesota faces a sudden spike in energy costs, those massive utility companies do not absorb the financial blow. They never do. every single dollar of that regulatory burden is passed directly onto the everyday consumer. The infrastructure connecting Ontario to the American Midwest and Northeast serves as a vital economic artery. When Ontario threatened to extract $400,000 per day from the American economy, the financial shockwaves filtered through regional electricity pricing algorithms instantly. For the residents living within those affected regions, this dynamic means that turning on your air conditioner during a hot summer afternoon or heating your home during a brutal winter freeze is no longer a predictable expense. It is now a volatile variable tied directly to the unstable political relationship between President Donald Trump and Canadian provincial leaders. The financial pressure ripples through every layer of the domestic economy, forcing local businesses to raise their prices to compensate for skyrocketing overhead costs. Your wallet is the target. Your personal savings, your household purchasing power, and your job security are all tied to this hidden grid. If Ontario decides to pull the trigger on this energy surcharge again as the July 2026 review deadline approaches, the economic fallout will extend far beyond your monthly utility statement. Heavy manufacturing plants in Michigan will see their operational margins collapse. Commercial real estate sectors in New York will face massive increases in baseline maintenance costs. Local distribution networks in Minnesota will be forced to recalculate their entire logistical budgets. This is the hidden machinery of inflation. You pay more for groceries, you pay more for consumer goods, and you pay more for basic services because the underlying energy grid has been injected with a massive geopolitical risk premium. Not next year, not next month, right now. The 24-hour standoff in March 2025 proved that your household stability is actively being used as a bargaining chip in a high-stakes trade negotiation. The United States economy is fundamentally dependent on foreign baseload power to maintain its current standard of living. When the cost of that power fluctuates due to political retaliation, the average citizen bears the entire financial burden. The politicians in Washington can celebrate a public relations victory all they want, but the structural vulnerability remains completely unaddressed. The next time a trade dispute escalates, the financial cost will not be measured in political talking points. It will be deducted directly from your bank account. The illusion of cheap energy is officially dead. The calendar has brought the international community to the critical juncture of June 2026, with the formal July 1st, 2026 review deadline for the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement looming directly ahead. The temporary truce established during the chaotic 24-hour standoff of March 2025 is rapidly expiring, leaving three distinct pathways for the immediate future of North American trade and energy security. The first pathway represents the best-case scenario, characterized as a fragile diplomatic peace. Under this trajectory, intense behind-the-scenes negotiations between United States Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick and Canadian trade representatives yield a comprehensive compromise before the July deadline. President Donald Trump secures specific concessions regarding American dairy market access, while Ontario permanently shelves the 25% electricity surcharge in exchange for stable steel and aluminum exemptions. In this outcome, energy infrastructure returns to its traditional role as a silent, invisible commercial arrangement, and consumer utility bills remain insulated from immediate political shocks. The second and most probable pathway involves a tactical, controlled escalation. As trade negotiations inevitably stall over complex automotive content rules, Ontario Premier Doug Ford selectively reactivates the 25% electricity surcharge on a rotating basis, deliberately targeting Michigan, New York, and Minnesota during peak summer demand hours. Rather than triggering a full-scale trade war, this calculated move serves as an active bargaining chip, forcing the Trump administration back to the negotiating table to prevent sudden localized inflation in key industrial sectors. This scenario keeps the markets on edge, but prevents a total economic collapse through rapid, targeted diplomatic interventions. The third and most dangerous pathway is the worst-case scenario of a total infrastructure conflict. If President Donald Trump enacts sweeping, non-negotiable tariffs across all Canadian imports, the leadership in Toronto could retaliate by deploying what trade analysts call the nuclear option, severely restricting not just electricity exports, but the massive flow of Canadian crude oil to the American Midwest. This extreme escalation causes immediate severe power instability across the interconnected grid, forces automated utility pricing to skyrocket, and triggers blackouts in major metropolitan areas during peak load seasons. The ultimate lesson of this ongoing economic crisis transcends the specific text of trade treaties or the aggressive rhetoric of political leaders. True geopolitical power in the 21st century does not belong exclusively to the nation, with the largest gross domestic product or the most dominant military force. Power belongs to the entity that controls the physical switch of critical infrastructure. The general public is conditioned to focus on the visible theater of presidential decrees and public press conferences, but the underlying stability of modern civilization depends entirely on invisible networks of energy flowing silently across borders. The vulnerability exposed by Ontario remains completely active, waiting for the next political catalyst to spark a fire. Citizens must now state their perspective in the comments section regarding the reality of American economic independence when the power to illuminate 1,500,000 American homes rests entirely in foreign hands.